In a quiet American town wrapped in morning mist, a weary war veteran arrives with his loyal German shepherd, the only comrade who never left his side. He dreams of peace, of mornings without echoes of war. But when his dog growls at the gentle schoolteacher everyone trusts, the silence of Maple Hill begins to crack. What if the real battle isn't fought on foreign soil, but in the places that pretend to be safe? Tell us where you're watching from, and stay until the end, because the truth buried in this town will test what you believe about kindness, courage, and faith. The town of Maple Hill woke beneath a pale veil of morning mist, the kind that softened the world until everything seemed like a memory. The maple trees lining the road had turned fire red, their leaves falling in slow spirals onto the cracked asphalt. Through the quiet haze, an old blue pickup truck rolled into town, its engine murmuring like an aging soldier who'd seen too much. Behind the wheel sat Ethan Ward, a 38-year-old veteran whose eyes had learned to carry silence better than words. Ethan had once been a tall, broad-shouldered man who filled rooms with laughter and confidence, but war had carved new lines into his face. His brown hair was flecked with early gray, his posture still disciplined, yet every movement carried the ghost of caution. He wore a weathered flannel shirt beneath a military-style jacket, its fabric faded but clean. On his left wrist, a leather bracelet engraved with coordinates, where he'd lost 2 brothers in arms. He didn't speak of them, he simply touched the bracelet when the wind grew too still. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Shadow, his 6-year-old German shepherd. Shadow's coat shimmered deep sable with tan highlights at the legs and muzzle, eyes sharp amber that missed nothing. Once a military working dog in Afghanistan, he had been trained to detect explosives, but more than that, he had learned to read the human heart. Calm, alert, and fiercely loyal, Shadow bore a small scar above his left ear, a faint reminder of the day he saved Ethan's life in an ambush. Now, far from gunfire, his world was Ethan's family. The pickup came to a slow stop before a small elementary school perched atop a hill, the sign out front reading Maple Hill Elementary in peeling white letters. The bell tower gleamed faintly in the mist. Through the windshield, Ethan saw children in bright jackets laughing, parents waving, the scent of autumn drifting through. In the back seat sat Sophie Ward, Ethan's daughter, 8 years old, with a quiet, searching gaze that always seemed older than her years. Her hair was chestnut brown, falling in a soft braid over her shoulder. She wore a yellow coat, the sleeves slightly too long, and clutched a notebook covered in stickers of stars and dogs. Below her denim skirt, her right leg was metal, a prosthetic crafted with precision but still heavy to her small frame. She shifted uncomfortably, the sound of the joint clicking softly in the quiet truck. Ethan turned toward her. "You ready, kiddo?" Sophie hesitated, eyes fixed on the playground where other children were running. Her voice came out small but steady. "What if they laugh?" Ethan smiled, lines deepening around his eyes. "Then you show them what strength really looks like." For a moment, the mist outside seemed to thin, sunlight breaking through in threads of gold. He stepped out and opened her door. Sophie slid from the seat, balancing carefully as she adjusted her backpack. Shadow hopped down, beside her, tail swaying, his body forming a protective wall between her and the world. The schoolyard was alive with morning chatter. Parents hurried children inside, the scent of wet leaves mixed with the distant hum of bells. Standing at the top of the stairs was Grace Hollins, the 3rd-grade teacher. Grace was in her mid-40s, tall and slender, with auburn hair pinned neatly into a bun. Her glasses gleamed under the gray light, and her smile was polished, practiced, almost rehearsed. On the surface, she radiated warmth, soft voice, gentle gestures, the kind of woman people trusted without question. But up close, her eyes carried a peculiar emptiness, like someone who smiled because she had forgotten how to do anything else. Years ago, Grace had been a celebrated teacher in another district, until a controversy, never fully spoken of, had driven her away. Some said a student's accident had broken her spirit. Others whispered she'd been too harsh, too controlling. Whatever the truth, it had left her brittle. "Mr. Ward," she greeted, her voice honeyed. "Welcome to Maple Hill, and you must be Sophie." She crouched slightly, looking at the girl. "You're very brave to start at a new school. We'll take good care of you here." Sophie managed a shy nod. Ethan smiled politely, but Shadow stood rigid, his fur along the spine lifted slightly, nostrils flaring. His low, controlled growl was almost inaudible, but Ethan noticed. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured, resting a hand on Shadow's neck. Shadow didn't break eye contact with Grace. His tail stopped wagging. Grace chuckled lightly, stepping back. "Big dog. Protective, I see." "Yeah," Ethan replied quietly. "He's seen a few things." She gestured toward the classroom entrance, her tone warm again. "You can rest assured, Sergeant Ward. We'll make Sophie feel right at home." As Sophie walked inside, her prosthetic foot clicked softly against the floor tiles. The sound echoed faintly down the hallway, a rhythm both brave and fragile. Grace's smile held steady, but her eyes followed that sound a bit too long, as though it scratched at something deep within her. Ethan stayed by the doorway, watching his daughter take a seat by the window. The classroom walls were painted soft yellow, filled with children's drawings of rainbows and autumn trees. Sophie sat near a boy with sandy blonde hair, Ben Taylor, 9, curious and bright-eyed, and a quiet girl with dark curls, Lila Perez, who kept folding and unfolding a paper crane. Ben offered Sophie a timid wave. She smiled back, hesitant but grateful. Grace began morning greetings, her tone crisp yet soothing. Ethan could tell she ran her class like a script, every gesture measured, every pause deliberate. For a moment, he thought maybe Shadow had been wrong. Maybe she was just a little formal. He crouched beside Shadow outside the classroom window. "She's gonna be okay," he said softly. "This is a fresh start." Shadow's ears twitched. His amber eyes never left the teacher's movements. When the final bell rang that afternoon, the sun had melted the mist into thin ribbons of warmth. Sophie emerged from the building, cheeks flushed, backpack bouncing slightly. She was smiling, at least on the surface. Ethan felt relief loosen something in his chest. "How was it?" he asked. "It was okay," she said. Her eyes darted away for a second too long. Grace stepped out behind her, holding a stack of papers. "She did very well. The children are still getting used to her, of course, but Sophie has such spirit." Ethan nodded, unsure why the compliment felt like a blade wrapped in silk. Shadow, sitting at Ethan's side, suddenly growled again, barely audible but deep enough to vibrate through the air. Grace's smile froze. For a split second, a flicker of irritation crossed her face, cold, precise, and quickly masked. "Perhaps keep him outside during drop-offs," she suggested lightly. "Some of the children are afraid of dogs." Ethan gave a polite smile. "He's harmless. He just reads people, that's all." Grace's eyes lingered on him, then on the dog. "I'm sure he does." The camera of life might have ended the scene there, with a father, his daughter, and a loyal dog walking down the sunlit hill. But as they reached the truck, Shadow turned back one last time. His ears perked. He watched Grace watching Sophie. The teacher's expression softened again into that same pleasant smile, but this time, her eyes stayed unblinking, too still for kindness. Shadow's tail lowered. A quiet rumble echoed in his throat, like a storm gathering beneath the calm sky. Ethan opened the truck door, helping Sophie climb in. "You did good today, kiddo." "Thanks, Dad." She leaned against the window, watching the red leaves dance in the wind as they drove off. From the hilltop, Grace stood motionless, arms folded, until their truck disappeared down the road. Then she turned, her face once again serene, and stepped back inside her classroom. The sound of her heels clicked sharply, each step measured, deliberate. And in that empty hallway, for just a moment, the wind outside carried a low growl through the open window. It wasn't loud enough for anyone to hear, but Shadow, riding in the back of the truck, lifted his head suddenly and stared into the distance. His eyes caught the reflection of the school building, disappearing in the mirror, and in them burned the golden fire of something ancient and certain, instinct. Some part of him already knew. Peace never lasts long in places where evil hides behind smiles. The wind had changed in Maple Hill. The golden leaves that once danced freely now scraped across the schoolyard like brittle confessions. Mornings were colder, the light thinner. Every day, Ethan parked his old blue pickup under the same maple tree, watching his daughter climb the steps of Maple Hill Elementary with Shadow trotting faithfully beside her. Each time, Sophie turned to wave, a small, brave gesture that kept Ethan standing there long after she disappeared through the school doors. but lately her wave had grown smaller. Inside room 3A, the air smelled faintly of chalk dust and lavender polish. The walls, once filled with colorful drawings, now seemed quieter, almost staged. Grace Hollins glided between the rows of desks with her usual grace. Today she wore a gray cardigan and pearl earrings that caught the weak sunlight. Her smile, as always, was perfect, yet cold as porcelain. "Good morning, class," she said. Her tone was soft, but each word carried a rhythm too precise to be spontaneous. "Let's begin our gratitude circle. Sophie, why don't you start?" 8-year-old Sophie Ward looked up, startled. Her pencil paused mid-sketch. "Me?" "Yes, dear," Grace cooed. "You've overcome so much. Tell us something you're grateful for." The room fell silent. Around her, children fidgeted. Sophie hesitated, then whispered, "I'm grateful for my dad, and for Shadow." Grace smiled sweetly. "That's lovely. Everyone, let's clap for Sophie, for being so brave despite her challenge." Her voice dipped delicately on the last word. A few kids clapped hesitantly, others giggled. Sophie's face flushed crimson as she looked down at her metal leg gleaming under the sunlight. Now, Grace said lightly. "There's no shame in being different. We can still try, can't we?" The laughter grew. Camera close up. Sophie's trembling hands clutch her notebook. A single tear splashes on the corner of her sketch. Shadow drawn in bright crayon, standing tall beside her father. Grace straightened her papers and continued the lesson, her smile never faltering. That afternoon, when Ethan came to pick Sophie up, she emerged slower than usual. The hallways buzzed with the noise of children rushing home. Sophie's shoulders slumped under her backpack. Her braid was loose, her eyes puffy. Ethan crouched beside her. "Hey, how was school?" "Fine," she said too quickly. He studied her face, then caught sight of the corner of her notebook. The crayon drawing was smudged, and the words "Shadow is brave" had been scribbled over. Before he could ask, the classroom door opened. Grace appeared, smiling as always. "Mr. Ward," she greeted, her voice light. "Sophie's adjusting well. She just needs a little structure." "Structure?" Ethan echoed. "Yes," Grace said pleasantly. "Children like her thrive on it. I simply remind the class that everyone should be grateful for what they have." Shadow stood beside Ethan, tail still, eyes locked on her. A low growl pulsed deep in his chest, so soft that only Ethan heard it. He forced a polite nod. "Appreciate what you're doing, ma'am." Grace tilted her head. "Of course. It's all for the children." Later that evening, Maple Hill turned gold beneath the setting sun. The Ward home, an old cabin at the edge of town, smelled of pine resin and warm soup. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his journal open, his handwriting steady but tired. War ended years ago, but maybe peace is just another kind of battle. He looked up as Sophie's soft footsteps approached. She wore pajamas patterned with tiny stars, her prosthetic leg clicking softly against the wooden floor. "Dad?" she asked quietly. "Do you think people mean it when they smile?" Ethan's pen froze. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" She shrugged. "Sometimes it feels like they're pretending." He smiled faintly. "Smiles can hide a lot of things, but yours is real." She smiled a little, though her eyes stayed clouded. Shadow, lying near the fireplace, lifted his head. His ears flicked toward the window. Outside, the wind hissed through the pines like whispered warning. Ethan's gaze followed. He wrote another line in his notebook. "Some wars never end. They just change their battlefield." The following week, the pattern deepened. Grace's kindness became a cage. She would praise Sophie in front of the class. "Isn't she brave?" But the words carried the same sharpness as a blade drawn slowly across silk. The children learned from her tone. They whispered when Sophie limped. They snickered when her metal leg clanked against her chair. Ben Taylor, the sandy-haired boy who sat beside her, often frowned at the mockery. He was an observant child, restless, bold. His older brother, a tech enthusiast, had once built small gadgets from broken radios. Ben had learned from him how to make things work, and how to make things record. One afternoon, as laughter filled the classroom after another motivational speech from Grace, Ben slipped his hand into his pencil case, brushing the small red switch on the hidden recorder inside. The faint click went unnoticed, swallowed by the noise of children. Across the room, Lila Perez, the quiet girl with dark curls, bit her lip. She watched Sophie pretend to smile while folding another paper crane. When Sophie dropped it, Lila bent to pick it up and whispered, "Don't listen to them." Sophie whispered back, "It's okay, I'm used to it." But her voice cracked on the last word. After school, Ethan noticed a faint bruise on Sophie's wrist as she climbed into the truck. "What happened?" he asked. She pulled her sleeve down quickly. "I fell." Ethan's stomach tightened. "Did someone?" "No, Dad," she said, forcing a smile. "It was just me." Shadow whined from the back seat. His amber eyes flicked between them, restless. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The clock ticked endlessly. Outside, the forest rustled with unseen movement. He rose, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and sat by the window. Shadow lay beside him, head on his paws. His ears twitched every time the wind howled through the trees. Ethan flipped through his journal again. Between the lines of ink, one sentence stood out, circled twice. "Some battles are fought in silence." He looked at Shadow. "You feel it too, don't you?" Shadow's ears perked, his eyes glinting in the dim light. He stood, padded to the window, and growled softly toward the direction of the school hill. Ethan followed his gaze. In the distance, under the pale moon, Maple Hill Elementary stood quiet, its windows dark except for one faint light in room 3A. Grace was still there, her silhouette moving slowly between desks. Ethan frowned. "What the hell are you still doing there?" Shadow's growl deepened, low and instinctive. Days turned colder. The red maples shed their leaves, leaving skeletal branches against the gray sky. In the classroom, the tension was now a quiet ache. Sophie spoke less. Grace's smiles grew tighter, her tone sweeter, too sweet. Each compliment carried venom. "You're very lucky, Sophie," Grace said one morning, voice dripping with false admiration. "Most children would struggle with your condition." Sophie's hands clenched on her desk. Her prosthetic leg tapped lightly, a rhythmic sound of endurance. Ben glanced at her, then at the pencil box, where his recorder blinked faintly. Outside, a cold gust rattled the window. Grace turned sharply toward it, her expression hardening for just a second. When she faced the class again, her smile returned, but her eyes didn't. That evening, when Ethan arrived at the school, Sophie was sitting alone on the steps, hugging her backpack. The late autumn wind tugged at her braid. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "What happened?" She didn't look up. "Nothing." Shadow pressed close to her, whining softly. Ethan reached out and brushed a leaf from her shoulder. "You know, when people hurt you with words, that's still a kind of war." Sophie looked up at him, eyes glassy. "Then why don't grown-ups stop it?" he sighed. "Because some grown-ups forget what courage really means." Behind them, the school windows reflected the dying light of sunset. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw a shadow move in one of the rooms, a tall figure standing too still. When he looked again, it was gone. Shadow barked once, sharp and sudden. The sound echoed across the hill. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's neck. "Easy, boy, easy." But Shadow's eyes remained locked on that window, unblinking. The sun slipped behind the ridge, and Maple Hill sank into a cold twilight. The war Ethan thought he'd left behind was finding its way back to him, this time through his child's tears. And somewhere in the fading light, Grace Hollins stood alone in her classroom, looking out at the road, her reflection fractured across the glass. She touched her pearl earring absently, as though listening to something only she could hear. Morning crept into Maple Hill beneath a shroud of gray. The first frost glazed the rooftops, and the fields wore a dull silver mist. The school bell echoed faintly through the cold air, a sound too cheerful for the silence that lived beneath it. Ethan Ward parked his old blue pickup at the bottom of the hill as usual, but something about the day felt heavier. Even Shadow sensed it. The dog sat rigid in the passenger seat, amber eyes fixed on the school, tail still as stone. Inside room 3A, the hum of voices was different now. The laughter of children had changed, no longer innocent, but sharp-edged, like glass in sunlight. Grace Hollins, immaculate as ever, stood by the chalkboard in a navy skirt and cream blouse, her hair tied back with the precision of habit. Her expression was calm, but her tone carried something colder than winter. "Now, class," she said, "we'll practice reading aloud. Confidence is important, even when you have disadvantages." Her gaze brushed Sophie like a shadow. Sophie looked down at her book. Her small hands trembled slightly. Her prosthetic leg tapped nervously beneath the desk. Grace smiled thinly. "Sophie, dear, why don't you start?" A hush fell. Sophie's lips parted, voice soft and clear. But every stutter drew a titter from the back row. "Louder, please," Grace interrupted, tone sharp behind the smile. "We can't pity you forever, can we?" The laughter grew. Ben Taylor, the boy with sandy hair, clenched his fists. He had seen this too many times. Grace's kindness was a knife disguised as praise. He glanced at Lila Perez, the shy girl with dark curls who sat beside Sophie. Her eyes were wide, her mouth pressed tight. When the bell finally rang, Sophie hurried out before anyone could speak to her. Grace called after her, "Remember, dear, effort matters more than excuses." Ben watched her go. Then he reached into his backpack, fingers brushing the small recording device hidden inside. The red light blinked faintly, proof of what adults refused to see. By the time Ethan arrived that afternoon, clouds had rolled in thick and low. Sophie sat on the steps again, hugging her backpack, her face turned away. The prosthetic leg gleamed wet with drizzle. "Hey, champ," Ethan said softly, crouching beside her. "Long day." She nodded but didn't speak. He brushed a leaf from her hair. "You sure nothing's wrong?" Her lips trembled. "It's just kids. I'm fine." Shadow pressed close to her, resting his head on her knee. She stroked his fur absently, whispering, "At least you never laugh." Ethan looked toward the windows of room 3A. Through the glass, he saw Grace erasing the board with slow, precise movements. She didn't look out, but somehow he felt her watching. When he turned back to Sophie, she was already climbing into the truck, shoulders hunched against the wind. That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the dim lamp flickering over his open journal. The worst wars don't happen in deserts or cities. They happen in places where people pretend to care. He stared at those words until the ink blurred. Shadow lay under the table, head resting on Ethan's boot. The dog's tail thumped once, then stopped. Outside, the wind moaned through the pines, and Ethan thought he heard a distant echo. Laughter, thin and cruel, carried from the hill where the school stood. He closed the journal and whispered, "We're missing something, boy." Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching. At school the next morning, the whispers had multiplied. Small pieces of paper appeared in Sophie's desk, scrawled with jagged letters. "One-legged girl, robot leg, fake hero." She tried to ignore them. She pressed her hand against the prosthetic, wishing it would disappear. Grace saw the paper once and said nothing. She simply smiled, adjusted her glasses, and continued teaching. By lunchtime, the storm had settled in Sophie's chest. She sat alone at a table near the window, pushing food around her tray. Ben slid into the seat beside her. "You okay?" She shook her head. "It's fine." "No, it's not," he said quietly. "She shouldn't talk to you like that. None of them should." Sophie looked up, startled by his seriousness. "You can't stop her." "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I can make people listen." He reached into his pocket and tapped the recorder. "She won't know." Lila appeared beside them, clutching her lunchbox. "Ben, that's dangerous," she whispered. "If she finds out—" Ben's eyes hardened. "Then she'll stop." That afternoon, Ethan waited by the truck while rain drummed softly on the windshield. Shadow paced in the back seat, uneasy. Sophie came out late again. Her hair was damp, her expression distant. "Did something happen?" Ethan asked as she climbed in. She hesitated. "Dad, do people ever pretend to be nice just to hurt you later?" Ethan froze. "Where'd that come from?" She shrugged. "Nowhere." Shadow whined softly, pressing his nose to her shoulder. Ethan watched her through the mirror all the way home, heart tight with unspoken dread. That night, the rain turned to sleet. The ward cabin crackled with the sound of wood in the stove. Ethan read Sophie a bedtime story, though she fell asleep halfway through. Shadow lay curled by the door, his ears alert even in rest. When the fire dimmed, Ethan returned to his journal. Sometimes the enemy doesn't wear a uniform. A sudden noise made him pause, a faint scratching at the window. Shadow leapt up, barking once. Ethan pulled the curtain aside, just branches swaying, nothing more. Yet in the distance, atop the hill, the school loomed dark against the storm, one light still burning in room 3A. The next day brought a new cruelty. Grace began the class by handing back math papers. "Most of you did well," she said, "except for one." She stopped beside Sophie's desk, voice almost gentle. "Maybe numbers are harder with extra weight on your mind." The children laughed again. Ben's jaw tightened. He leaned closer to Lila. "It's recording," he whispered. Lila looked terrified, but she didn't stop him. Sophie bit her lip until it bled. The laughter blurred around her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her prosthetic leg felt like an anchor. When the bell rang, she limped to the hallway, tears streaming down her face. Grace called after her, "Remember, Sophie, courage isn't about crying, it's about trying." Ben followed her out, fists clenched. Lila trailed behind. In the corner of the hallway, the small recorder blinked faintly inside his pencil case, capturing every word. That evening, Ethan noticed something different when Sophie came home. She was silent, yes, but there was something else in her eyes now, not just sadness, fear. As she changed clothes, he saw faint bruises along her forearm. "What happened to your arm?" he asked. She pulled the sleeve down. "Nothing. Please don't make it worse." The words hit him like a punch. "Worse?" Sophie looked at him, voice trembling. "If you tell, she'll make it worse." Ethan's breath caught. Shadow stood beside him, growling low. He crouched, forcing calm into his voice. "Who will, Sophie?" Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Miss Hollins." Ethan froze. For a moment, the house fell utterly silent except for the storm outside. Then Shadow barked sharply, pacing toward the door, as if ready to hunt the invisible threat. Ethan gathered Sophie in his arms. "No one's going to hurt you again. Not her, not anyone." In the flickering firelight, Shadow stood guard at the window, his reflection merging with the night, the silent sentinel of a family at war again, but this time without guns or medals. Up the hill, in the empty classroom of room 3A, Grace sat alone at her desk, the faint hum of the old heater filling the silence. On her desk lay a folder of student files, each marked with neat notes in red ink. Her lips curved slightly as she underlined another phrase: behavioral improvement required. Outside, the wind rattled the glass. Down below, in the cabin, Shadow lifted his head suddenly, eyes glowing amber in the dark. He stared toward the hill, muscles tense, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. He could not speak the human word for what was coming, but he knew it by scent, by instinct. A war had begun. One without soldiers, one where truth itself was the weapon. And somewhere in that unseen battlefield, a child had already chosen courage. The first snow of Maple Hill came without warning. Overnight, the red leaves vanished beneath a soft white hush, and the whole town seemed to hold its breath. At dawn, the air was sharp and clean, every sound amplified. The crunch of boots on ice, the whisper of wind through pine. In the ward cabin, Ethan woke early, coffee steaming in his hands as he watched flakes drift across the window. Shadow stood by the door, tail stiff, ears flicking restlessly. He had been uneasy all morning. Sophie sat at the table, tying her braid with clumsy fingers. Her eyes were distant, movements slow. There were faint shadows beneath them now, the kind that didn't come from sleeplessness alone. Ethan tried to smile. "Big day, huh? First snow of the year?" She nodded absently. "I guess." He crouched beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You sure you're okay going in today?" "I have to," she said quietly. "We're doing our winter presentation." Ethan studied her face, too pale for comfort. He wanted to keep her home, but Sophie was like him. She fought by showing up. "All right," he said softly. But Shadow's coming with us today. Sophie looked up, almost smiling. You mean into the school? Ethan winked. Just until the front gate. He likes watching over you. Shadow gave a low woof, as if agreeing. The school hill was blanketed in white. Children's laughter rang through the morning, but even joy sounded muted in the cold air. As Sophie climbed the steps, Shadow walked beside her, paws leaving deep prints in the snow. Ethan lingered at the gate, watching his daughter vanish inside the brick building. He turned to leave, and then Shadow froze. The dog's body tensed, hackles raised. His gaze locked on the second-floor window of room 3A. Ethan followed his stare and saw Grace Hollins standing there, arms crossed, face framed by falling snow. Even from a distance, her eyes were sharp as glass. For a moment, the world was utterly silent. Then Shadow growled, low, guttural, primal. Ethan frowned. Easy, boy. But Shadow didn't relax until the figure at the window turned away. Inside, the morning began with forced cheer. Grace stood before the class, dressed impeccably as always. Gray wool dress, pearl earrings, hair pinned tight. Good morning, children, she said, voice smooth as honey over ice. Before our winter readings, I want to talk about gratitude again. It's important to be thankful for what we have, even when life doesn't give us everything. Her eyes flicked towards Sophie. The class snickered. Ben's fists tightened beneath the desk. Lila's lips trembled. Grace turned to the board, chalk screeching faintly as she wrote, "Gratitude is strength." "Sophie," she said sweetly, "why don't you read your essay aloud for everyone?" Sophie's hands trembled as she picked up her notebook. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I wrote about my dad and my dog." "Louder, please," Grace said. "Confidence, dear." Sophie's voice cracked. "My dad taught me that being strong isn't about fighting. It's about—" "Enunciate," Grace interrupted, tone sharp. Ben's pencil snapped in half. Lila stared at the teacher, tears forming in her eyes. Grace smiled wider. "Perhaps you can't speak clearly with that brace pressing against your leg. Take your time." A ripple of cruel laughter spread across the room. Sophie's face crumpled. She dropped the paper, blinking rapidly as her cheeks burned. "Enough!" Ben shouted suddenly. The class froze. Grace turned slowly, her voice dangerously calm. "Excuse me?" Ben stood up, shaking. "You can't keep talking to her like that. Sit down, Benjamin." "I won't." His voice trembled, but his eyes were bright with fury. "You think we don't hear you? We know what you're doing." Grace's smile vanished. "Principal's office, now." But Ben didn't move. Instead, he reached into his pocket and held up a small recorder, the red light still blinking. The room fell silent. Grace's face turned pale, then cold as steel. "Give me that." Ben's hands shook. "It's proof!" For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then Grace stepped forward. "Hand it over." Her voice was no longer honeyed. It was jagged, sharp. Before she could reach him, the classroom door burst open. The sound that filled the hallway was unlike anything human. A deep, thunderous bark that made every child jump. Shadow. The German shepherd stood at the threshold, fur bristling, teeth bared. His growl rolled through the air like thunder. Behind him, Ethan appeared, breath steaming in the cold. "Dad!" Sophie cried. "What's going on here?" Ethan's voice was calm, but carried the weight of command, the kind learned from battlefields. Grace straightened instantly, forcing her mask back on. "We were just having a misunderstanding. Your daughter is scared," Ethan finished for her. "She's scared, Miss Hollins. I can see it." Grace's lips tightened. "Mr. Ward, you can't just walk into my class." "I heard her scream," Ethan said, voice low. "That's why I came in." For a moment, they stood there in a quiet standoff, soldier versus smiling tyrant. Snowlight filtered through the windows, turning everything cold and sharp. Then, behind Ethan, Nurse Clara Taylor appeared, holding her clipboard. A sturdy woman in her 40s with kind eyes and weathered hands, Clara was Ben's mother and the school's part-time nurse. "Ethan," she said softly, "you should hear this." She took the recorder from Ben's trembling hands and pressed play. The classroom filled with Grace's voice, that same silky tone, now twisted by cruelty. Even with one leg, you should at least try to look capable. No one's going to pity a cripple forever. Each word hung in the air like frost. Grace froze. The children stared, stunned into silence. Lila buried her face in her hands. Sophie began to cry quietly, Shadow pressing close to her legs. Ethan's expression didn't change, but his voice was barely above a whisper. "That's what you call teaching?" Grace's face twitched. "That recording is illegal. You can't—" Clara cut her off. "You think this is the first time, Grace? I checked the medical records. 5 children in your class have unexplained bruises. You said they fell." A ripple of murmurs filled the room. Grace stepped back, breathing fast. "This is ridiculous." Ethan took a step closer. "So, is hurting a child to make yourself feel powerful?" She met his eyes. For a brief moment, the facade cracked, a flash of something desperate, unhinged. "You don't understand. They have to be strong. The world doesn't forgive weakness." Ethan's voice softened, almost pitying. "That's not strength. That's cruelty." Later that evening, the school was silent. Snow fell thicker now, coating everything in a muffled calm. Inside the principal's office, the light was dim. Grace sat across from the school board, hands folded tightly. Clara and Ethan sat nearby, Ben and Sophie waiting outside with Shadow. The recording played again. No one spoke. When it ended, the principal cleared his throat. "Miss Hollins, effective immediately, you are suspended pending termination." Grace's lips parted, but no words came. For a second, she looked almost small, a woman consumed by her own bitterness. Then she rose, spine stiff. "You'll regret this," she whispered, and walked out into the snow. Outside the door, Sophie saw her pass and flinched instinctively. Grace didn't look at her. She simply walked away, the snow swallowing her footsteps. Ethan knelt beside his daughter. "It's over," he said softly. "You did nothing wrong." Sophie looked up, tears glimmering in her eyes. "Ben did it. He's the brave one." Ethan smiled faintly. "So are you. You spoke through silence." Behind them, Shadow sat by the window, watching the snow fall. The glow from the streetlight reflected in his golden eyes, calm now, no longer wary. The battle had ended, not with shouting, but with truth. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft, endless, pure. Then snow had a way of making even truth feel fragile. The day after Grace Hollins was dismissed, Maple Hill lay beneath a sky of pale light and drifting flakes. The town was quiet, too quiet, as though holding its breath after a long cry. The hearing was scheduled that morning at the old Maple Hill School Board Hall, a brick building beside the frozen pond. Inside, the scent of wood polish mixed with the faint chill of old paper. Rows of chairs faced a long oak table, where the board members sat beneath a flag and a single brass lamp. Outside, parents gathered in muffled clusters, their voices low and uncertain. Ethan Ward stood near the back with his daughter, Sophie, bundled in a blue coat and wool hat. Her prosthetic leg peeked from beneath her long skirt, polished silver, gleaming faintly under the lights. She held Shadow's leash tightly, the German shepherd sitting obediently beside her. The dog's fur shimmered sable and gold under the lamp glow, his breath misting in calm, steady rhythm. For Ethan, this wasn't just a meeting. It felt like a battle line drawn across polished floors and whispered doubts. The weight in his chest was heavier than any gear he'd worn in Afghanistan. The door creaked open, and Grace Hollins entered. She wore a black coat and gloves, her red hair perfectly coiled, her posture rigid with pride. Her face, pale as porcelain, was expressionless. Yet her eyes still carried the cold fire of someone who believed herself wronged. Conversations hushed. Even the snow outside seemed to pause. Grace moved to the table and sat across from the board. Her lawyer, a thin man in a dark suit, stood beside her, adjusting his tie. At the far end of the room, Clara Taylor, the school nurse, her features calm but resolute, arranged folders of medical files. Her son Ben sat quietly next to Lila, their hands clasped under the table, drawing courage from each other. The chairwoman of the board, Mrs. Ellen March, a silver-haired woman with a firm yet kind face, cleared her throat. "We are here to review the matter concerning Mrs. Grace Hollins and allegations of misconduct toward her students. All parties present?" Grace nodded curtly. Ethan did the same. Mrs. March gestured to Clara. "Mrs. Taylor, please begin with your findings." Clara stood, voice steady. Over the past semester, I've treated several children from room 3A for bruises, stress-induced nausea, and anxiety. Each time, the explanation was the same: accidents, falls, or clumsiness. But after hearing the recording provided by Ben Taylor, I reviewed all reports and noticed a pattern. All 5 affected children were in Mrs. Holland's class. Grace's lawyer interrupted. Speculation, not proof. Clara didn't flinch. Then perhaps this will help. She held up a file. This is Sophie Ward's record. The injuries were consistent with restraint marks. They were not from a fall. A murmur rippled through the audience. Sophie shrank closer to Ethan. Shadow leaned against her leg, his warmth grounding her trembling body. Grace's jaw clenched. You're twisting facts. I was firm because children need discipline. The world doesn't tolerate weakness. Ethan rose slowly. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of something deeper. Discipline isn't cruelty, ma'am. I know the difference. I've seen both on battlefields. All eyes turned toward him. The veteran's stance was quiet but commanding, shoulders straight, gaze unwavering. My daughter came home every day afraid to speak, he said. Not because she didn't try hard enough, but because every word she said was used to shame her. You told her weakness is a sin, but the only sin here is breaking a child's spirit. Grace's lips trembled, but she forced a smile. You're emotional, Mr. Ward. You see war everywhere. Ethan's eyes softened. Maybe, but sometimes war hides in classrooms, and the casualties don't bleed. For a long moment, silence filled the room. The only sound was the faint tapping of snow against the windows. Then Clara nodded to Ben. The boy rose, hands shaking as he held up the small recorder. He pressed play. Grace's voice filled the chamber again, echoing from the tinny speaker. Even with one leg, you should at least try to look capable. The words hung heavy in the air. Gasps rippled through the room. Sophie pressed her face into Shadow's fur. The dog whimpered softly, nudging her hand. Grace's lawyer shot up. That recording could be edited. Children manipulate things. They don't understand context. Ethan turned toward him, calm but firm. Trained soldiers know the sound of truth, and so do parents. Mrs. March leaned forward. Mrs. Hollins, is that your voice? Grace hesitated, her facade faltering. Perhaps, but you must understand. There's nothing to understand, Clara interjected quietly. Only to acknowledge. Grace's eyes darted across the room, toward the children, toward Ethan, toward the dog, who stared at her with steady, golden judgment. You all want to paint me as a monster, she hissed. I gave those children structure, respect. You gave them fear, Ethan said. And fear isn't respect. For the first time, Grace's composure cracked, her eyes filled with tears, not of remorse, but humiliation. You think you're a hero because you fought in a war. I fought mine every day in that classroom. Ethan's voice lowered. Then you lost it the moment you stopped protecting them. The silence that followed was broken only by the faint hum of the radiator. Outside, snow began to fall heavier, flakes clinging to the window pane like delicate ghosts. Mrs. March cleared her throat. The board has heard enough. By unanimous decision, we move to terminate Mrs. Holland's employment immediately and revoke her teaching license. Indefinitely. The words landed softly but final, like the closing of a long, cold chapter. Grace stood, face drained of color. She looked at Ethan, not with hate, but with a hollow kind of disbelief. You think this changes anything? The world still eats the weak. Ethan held her gaze. Then, we'll teach it how to be kind. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Gathering her coat, she turned and walked toward the door. As it closed behind her, a single gust of snow swept into the room, swirling briefly before settling on the floor, quiet, white, and final. When the meeting ended, parents approached Ethan and Clara, their faces a mixture of relief and shame. Some apologized for not speaking sooner. Others simply nodded in gratitude. Sophie stood by the window, watching the snowfall. The world outside glowed soft and clean, as if the storm itself had come to wash away something rotten. Ben and Lila joined her, their reflections merging in the glass. You did it, Ben said quietly. Sophie shook her head. We all did. Outside, Shadow barked once. not in warning, but joy. His tail wagged as he bounded into the snow, chasing flakes like a puppy again. Ethan watched from the doorway, a rare smile warming his face. "Guess someone's happy." Sophie turned toward him. "Dad?" "Yeah?" She looked at the falling snow, her voice barely a whisper. "It feels lighter." He nodded. "That's what truth does. It clears the sky." They stood together, father and daughter, as the snow continued to fall. Around them, the town of Maple Hill breathed easier, the air no longer heavy with silence. And through the hush of winter, the faintest sound of children's laughter returned, honest this time, unshadowed by fear. Winter loosened its grip on Maple Hill slowly, like an old man releasing his cane after a long journey. The snow that had blanketed the rooftops melted into rivulets that whispered through the gutters, carrying the echoes of what had been. The air was no longer brittle but soft with the scent of wet earth and thawing pine. From the schoolyard to the cabin by the ridge, life began to stir again. It had been 3 months since the hearing. The wounds of that day, spoken and unspoken, were healing, though their scars still shone faintly like silver threads under sunlight. The town itself seemed different. Parents lingered longer when they dropped off their children. Teachers smiled not out of duty, but out of choice. The building that once felt cold now carried laughter again, laughter that didn't hide behind fear. On a warm April morning, Ethan Ward parked his blue pickup under the same maple tree that had once watched him through the hardest of days. The branches were budding new leaves, pale green against a baby blue sky. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the rhythmic panting of Shadow beside him. The German shepherd had aged gracefully. His coat gleamed sable in the sunlight. His body strong, though his muzzle had begun to show faint wisps of gray. Yet his spirit was the same, alert, loyal, endlessly patient. He turned his head toward the window of room 3A, ears twitching at the faint chorus of children's laughter. "Yeah," Ethan murmured, resting a hand on the dog's back. "Sounds better now, doesn't it?" Shadow gave a soft whine, leaning into his touch. Inside, the classroom looked brighter than ever. Sunlight streamed through the wide windows, falling across rows of new art projects, drawings of forests, families, and dogs that looked suspiciously like Shadow. At the front stood Mr. Thomas Turner, a tall man in his 40s with kind eyes and a voice like a campfire story, low, steady, and full of warmth. Turner had once served with Ethan in Afghanistan. Where Ethan carried silence like armor, Turner carried empathy like a flag. He walked with a slight limp from an old injury, but his energy was light and patient. On his first day, he'd hung a small sign above the chalkboard that read, "No one left behind." Now, he stood before the class with chalk dust on his sleeves and a smile that reached his eyes. "All right, troops," he said cheerfully. "Who remembers our motto?" The class replied in unison, their voices ringing bright. "No one left behind." Sophie Ward sat in the front row, her hair a little longer, her eyes brighter. Her prosthetic leg was newly painted, sky blue with tiny silver stars she'd drawn herself. She raised her hand proudly. "Even if someone falls behind, we wait," she recited. Turner nodded. "That's right, because courage isn't about being the fastest. It's about never walking away from someone who needs you." Ben grinned. "Betch beside her. Or some dog," he added, earning a ripple of laughter. Lila giggled. "Especially dogs." Mr. Turner chuckled. "Especially dogs." He turned to the board, sketching a quick doodle of a soldier and a German shepherd, standing side by side. The children clapped. Sophie leaned closer to whisper to Ben, "That looks just like Dad and Shadow." Outside, Ethan watched through the window, his face softening with pride. He could see how Sophie carried herself now, head high, eyes forward. Not as the girl who once hid behind silence, but as someone who had learned to stand tall on both flesh and steel. That afternoon, the Veterans Appreciation Assembly filled the school gym. Banners hung from the rafters, "Thank you for your service," painted in bright crayon letters. Folding chairs lined the floor, the scent of paper and spring flowers mingling with the hum of anticipation. Students sat in neat rows, restless with excitement. Parents filled the back seats, some in denim, some in Sunday best. On the stage stood a podium wrapped in a small American flag, and beside it, a silver bowl filled with medals for the town's local heroes. When Ethan stepped up to the podium, applause rippled through the room. He wasn't used to attention, but today wasn't about him. He wore a clean shirt, his dog tags tucked under the collar. Shadow padded beside him, head high, tail wagging gently. "Good afternoon," Ethan began, his voice calm and deep. "I used to think heroism was about what you survive, about the fights you win. But I've learned something else here, in this little town, in this little school." He paused, looking toward the front row, toward Sophie, Ben, and Lila. "Sometimes," he continued, "heroism isn't about battles or medals. It's about kindness, about choosing compassion when the world teaches you to look away. A hero isn't someone who never falls. It's someone who keeps standing and helps others stand too." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Ethan rested his hand on Shadow's back. "This boy here," he said, smiling faintly, "saved my life once. Not by fighting, but by refusing to leave me behind. And when we came home, I thought I'd left war behind us. But it found its way back in another form. This time, it wasn't bullets or bombs. It was silence, fear, and cruelty." He looked towards Sophie. "And yet, my daughter and her friends fought it the only way that ever truly works. With truth, with kindness, with courage." Mrs. March, seated among the audience, wiped her eyes. Mr. Turner stood at the back, hand pressed over his heart. Ethan's voice softened. "So today, we honor the veterans who fought overseas, but also those who fight invisible wars, teachers who protect their students, children who stand up for others, and dogs who remind us that loyalty is sacred." He turned to Shadow, who sat, perfectly still, golden eyes gleaming under the lights. "For that, Maple Hill has decided to honor our most loyal guardian." Gasps and cheers filled the gym as Mrs. March stepped forward, placing a small medal around Shadow's neck. The tag read, "Guardian of Maple Hill." The applause was thunderous. Shadow barked once, tail wagging wildly. Laughter broke the tension, echoing off the gym walls. Sophie ran to hug him, burying her face in his fur. "You did it, boy." Ethan knelt beside them, voice trembling with emotion. "No, sweetheart, we did." That evening, as the sun sank over Maple Hill, the ward cabin glowed with golden light. A fire crackled in the hearth, filling the room with the scent of pine and warmth. Sophie sat cross-legged by the rug, her metal leg catching the flicker of the flames as she stroked Shadow's fur. The metal around his neck clinked softly with every breath. Ethan sat nearby, reading from his journal. The once dark pages were now filled with new entries, gentler ones. March 17th. Sophie laughed again today. The sound was sunlight. Maybe some wars don't end. Maybe they just change shape until love finds them and makes them surrender. He looked up and smiled. "You know, kiddo, you've taught me something." Sophie tilted her head. "What?" "That courage isn't just about fighting. It's about loving, even when it hurts." She smiled, her eyes glimmering in the firelight. "You taught me that too." Outside, the last patches of snow melted into small streams that trickled down the hill. The sound of running water blended with birdsong, a promise that spring had returned not just to Maple Hill, but to the hearts within it. Ethan reached down to scratch behind Shadow's ears. The dog leaned into his hand, sighing contentedly. From somewhere deep in the forest, the first frogs of the season began to sing. The camera would pull back slowly now, through the cabin window, across the thawing landscape, over the small town breathing again under the twilight sky. And as the image faded, Ethan's voice would echo softly, like a prayer carried on spring wind. "Kindness is the quietest form of courage, and sometimes the loudest truth comes from the smallest voice. Sometimes God does not take away the storms in our lives. Instead, He teaches us how to walk through them with courage, faith, and love." Ethan and Sophie's story reminds us that miracles don't always come with thunder or light. Sometimes they come through a small act of kindness, a truth spoken in fear, or a loyal friend standing beside us. Every day God sends us little signs of His grace, in forgiveness, in hope, and in the people who refuse to give up on us. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that God still works miracles in quiet ways. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Subscribe for more stories of faith and love, and may God bless you and your family with peace, healing, and courage. Type Amen if you believe His light still shines, even in the darkest storms.